Bob, your theme of metaphors reminded me what first impressed me in your presentations was the choice of mind-opening metaphors. And you've been an inspiration to me for 35 years, amongst others by that choice of metaphors. Well, connections as the theme of this conference made me even more aware of how troubling is the disconnect between reality and what science is supposed to be telling us nowadays. Our Society for Scientific Exploration was named believing that scientific means empirical evidence-based understanding. And Bob John's peer group exemplified scrupulous evidence gathering. So it'd be incongruous, incredible, if scientific institutions were to say that something is settled science when the evidence is still uncertain or doubtful. Let alone that science would tell us that something is true when the evidence quite clearly says that it isn't. And yet that's what's happening. Not all the time, of course, but all too often, and on some of the most publicly important issues. Climate change, the evidence is uncertain. We're told the science is settled. The evidence is clear. We're told that HIV causes AIDS, and that is demonstrably wrong by the mainstream's own data and evidence. And even worse, when people blow the whistle, they're suppressed and persecuted. Of course, members of this society are familiar with that sort of reaction when it comes to topics like UFOs, parapsychology, and so on. But the point is that the same sort of thing is now happening squarely within mainstream medicine and science. And I realized that this must seem incredible even to members of this society. Because after all, we're aiming at a scientific approach. To say that science is not trustworthy is sort of like committing matricide or patricide. But the point is, you have to distinguish between science as it should be and science as it actually is. And the media and the policymakers are not aware of that distinction, and they certainly don't make that distinction. Let me ask you, is it conceivable that mainstream science could be wrong about something? See? Wholeheartedly, you say, of course, and so would mainstream scientists. But ask them, could mainstream science be wrong about carbon dioxide causing climate change? Could it be wrong about HIV causing AIDS? Could it be wrong about the Big Bang? And you would not get such a wholehearted response. And I don't think you'd get such a wholehearted response even from this group. The point is that several centuries of tremendous successes of mainstream science have given us good cause to trust science on the whole and in general. But Another distinction that fails to be made is between frontier science and older science. It is the well-established, long-lasting science that is pretty reliable. Nothing about contemporary science can be regarded as certain. But it is. The media treat us all the time to the latest breakthroughs, and then they don't bother to tell us when it turns out that those breakthroughs actually were mistaken in some way. The history of science is unfortunately understood properly only by academic specialists on the whole. The popular history of science tells us about steady advances, some of them so startling as to be called scientific revolutions. But the actual history of science is one of trials and errors and of advances being vigorously resisted, and the scientific revolutions that are milestones of progress are at the same time they're gravestones of what that scientific revolution overthrew. The point about scientific revolutions is that the earlier beliefs of mainstream science were wrong. They had to be changed. And the ignorance of history of science is particularly bad because in the last 50 years, there's also been a dramatic change in the nature of scientific activity. To put it in an oversimplified nutshell, most of modern science, most of the 2 or 3 centuries of modern science could be said to have been done by something like independent intellectual entrepreneurs. Nowadays, science is an integral part of big business, big government, international policy making, and that has brought pervasive conflicts of interest. The fact is, science is not its own thing anymore. It's been co-opted and corrupted. Well, those are generalities. Let me get down to data about one outstanding case. Here's what everyone knows about HIV. It's transmitted by sex, primarily. It causes AIDS. It's epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. It was inevitably fatal until life-saving drugs were developed. Here's what the actual evidence about HIV/AIDS is. There is a negligible risk of transmission via sex. The so-called HIV tests do not detect an HIV virus. You can be HIV positive for any number of reasons that includes things like pregnancy or happening to have African ancestry. All that is documented with more than 900 citations to the literature in this, on this website, the case against HIV/AIDS. Now, here are some more detailed things about HIV positive. I prefer saying HIV positive rather than HIV because HIV positive is something measurable, and HIV as a virus may not even exist. In the United States and around the world, there are some number of people who are in jail because they were HIV positive and had sex with someone without telling them that they were HIV positive. There is an organization, the Office of Medical and Scientific Justice, that offers its services to people who are charged with this offense. And if that offer is accepted, you are guaranteed to be found innocent, because when OMSJ is able to cross-examine in court experts from the mainstream side, they are forced to admit the risk of transmission is negligible. The most significant success that OMSJ had quite recently was that the US Court of Appeals for the military ruled unanimously that the risk of transmitting HIV or HIV positive is negligible because it's no more than 1 in 500. 1 in 500 acts of unprotected intercourse is the maximum risk of transmitting HIV. Isn't that very different from all of the public statements that you hear about HIV and about the dangers of passing it on? If you go to the CDC's website, you see that they admit your risk of passing on HIV if you're a male to a female is about 8 in 10,000. And from female to male, it's half of that. And compare that to the risk of passing on genuine, real, sexually transmitted diseases like gonorrhea or syphilis. The risk is 1 in 2. Here's the thing straight from the CDC website. And you see that the only way that there's a high risk of passing on HIV positive is through a blood transfusion. Think about it. You test blood by any old test, anything, it comes positive. You put that blood into a person. Isn't it remarkable that that blood still tests in exactly the same way as before? It tells you nothing about transmission or presence of an infectious thing. So, why do the media not broadcast the fact of negligible HIV transmission, negligible risk? Why do official statements continue to urge the use of condoms? And why is there continuing global hysteria about sexually transmitted HIV, and particularly in Africa? And by the way, if there is such an HIV epidemic in Africa, why are there not epidemics of syphilis and gonorrhea, which are transmitted hundreds of times more readily? I'm not going to answer those questions because they're rhetorical ones, and I just use them to express or emphasize my frustration about this situation. James Chin was an epidemiologist for the state of California and later for the World Health Organization. And as an epidemiologist, he calculated what it would take for the supposed African epidemic to have come about, given that the risk of transmission is so low. Well, it would take 20 to 40% of the sexually active population to have 10 sexual partners concurrently and to change them about every year. If that situation actually existed, you wouldn't need Chin's calculation to point it out. Here are just a few more little tidbits about transmission. No transmission has ever actually been observed when people they choose couples where one is positive and the other one isn't, and observe over time. No transmission has ever been observed. Porn stars do not usually wear condoms because the prospective audiences prefer that they don't. And over a 5-year period, the porn industry in California recorded 2 cases per year of HIV positive, as opposed to 260 cases of gonorrhea and 435 of chlamydia. Another peculiar thing about the idea of sexual transmission is that the people who are least likely to be sexually promiscuous are most likely to become HIV positive. Pregnant women, for example, or TB patients. And it turns out that married women are more at risk of becoming HIV positive than are prostitutes or women. Documentation of all of those things is on that website, The Case Against HIV. There are many other facts that speak against HIV as a cause of AIDS and so on, but the case of HIV and AIDS is unfortunately just one, admittedly outstanding example of the degree to which mainstream science and medicine manage to ignore the evidence. And I've mentioned a number of other examples in my 2012 book, Dogmatism in Science and Medicine. Prescription drugs are an outstanding example. Extinction of the dinosaurs, nuclear cold fusion, the dangers of secondhand smoke, Alzheimer's disease has been caused by amyloid plaque, which has been disproved any number of times. So today's science is nothing like the wonderful modern science that we enjoyed up to, I think, about the middle of the 20th century. And I'm afraid that this is one symptom of what the cultural historian Jacques Barzun wrote about in his last book. From Dawn to Decadence, 500 years of Western cultural life, 1500 to the present. And I think if science is not going to succumb in the way that it has been, it is going to be people in this society and like them who will stop science deteriorating in that way. Thank you.
The mid-20th century transition date that you still have showing up here, I think, is a tip-off to the source of the problem. The mid-century, with nuclear weapons, with the Sputnik terror and the space program, were when non-scientists became aware of the fact that science actually matters. So of course it became politicized then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Henry, you are a fine observer of the history of science and the philosophy of science. And as such, you've shown us for years about the problems with current scientific inquiry and the response of society. As an observer of science, you've probably also seen how revolutions do actually happen. and how change actually takes place. May I ask you to make some optimistic comments about what glimmer of hope you may see, where this change may happen that you're calling for?
Yeah, I was going to apologize to Garrett in my talk because several years ago he asked me next time I gave a talk to make it upbeat. The difficulty is that it is a society-wide problem. It's not internal to science. And so we're caught up in the same sort of overall denigration of, I suppose, almost any value that isn't purely economic. We measure everything in terms of economics. Science is measured in terms of economics. If you are trying to do science in an academic environment, you're judged by how much money you bring in. It used to be, 50 years ago, the university gave you the resources to do science. No longer. You're a money cow. So I don't know that there is any way of reforming what has happened to science without reforming a great deal about other aspects of society.
Do you mind if I make a response to Henry? Just for a second. Sorry. So one observation is that every generation says that the next generation is worse. You know, this goes, the kids don't behave anymore, they're addicted to screen time, they're this and that. And every generation is wrong because things change, they don't necessarily get worse. And change changes.
Actually, in terms of social attitudes, it is quite clear that the younger generations are heading in a much better direction than we are. So thank you. There is cause for optimism after
all. With your dating there and the timing that you've mentioned, is there any possibility that you could look at the loss of certainty in religion, switching over that the desire for certainty has never left, but instead of it aiming at religion, which continues to decline because people are questioning the, quote, truths, but people are still looking for truth, but they don't like any disagreement with what they've found as truth.
Right.
And we're still in the either or stage with most people. It's got to be either this or that. There's no middle ground. We can't even talk discussions that are civil where you're willing to listen to somebody else's disagreeing. I think this is a much wider problem that we're facing today that we really need to look at.
Yeah, I agree entirely, Cara, that there's still the quest for certainty, and in the West, at least, we discarded religion as a source of certainty and substituted science for it.
Henry, I'd just like to suggest that we're at the end of an era, and what you're describing and what I'll talk a little bit about on Saturday afternoon are the characteristics of the end of a paradigm, which then allow for the emergence of a new one. And so there's not much good news in the old paradigm, but there's a lot of good news coming in the new paradigm.
Thank you.